think the strategy reflects large input from Marco Rubio, the emphasis on the Western Hemisphere as a bastion of American control. I think this is probably going to fail because I don't believe the states of the Americas, the republics in the Americas, will accept the subjugation. Anthony Lake, who referred to enlargement and something or other, and I was at the Pentagon, and they said, this is vapidity on stilts. We cannot derive any policy from this. It sounded good. Engagement and enlargement was the phrase. So there's nothing new about rhetoric not being matched with effective strategic formulation. Well, the original sin of the overthrow of Mossadegh was indeed a crippling event in U.S. relationships with the Iranian people. That was a democracy. We should have welcomed it, but instead we supported British Petroleum's efforts to reestablish its control over Iranian. I think you're correct. And you can see that before the meeting that is scheduled for Muscat in Oman, the United States insisted the meeting be in Istanbul and planned to have the GCC members, the Gulf Cooperation Council, Arab members present, in effect, adding to the pressure on. I think you're quite right to raise that question because, of course, the last time there was a meeting in Muscat, it was used as a deception for a surprise attack by both Israel and the United States. It was very clear that that was planned. It was not something that happened on the spur of the moment. I think he's going to lose the midterm elections anyway, not for reasons connected to the Middle East particularly. But the people of Minnesota have demonstrated a level of resolve and discipline which is quite striking. And they're being nominated now for a Nobel Peace Prize for that, which I think they should get. Some of it is cooperative between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which have shared a desire to see regime change. The Istihbarat in Saudi Arabia and the Mossad have had a relationship. And I think, I can't prove this, that the atrocity in the Consulate General in Istanbul that was conducted against my friend Jamal Khashoggi was in fact conducted by people who had been trained by Israelis. All of the earmarks of an Israeli presence.
Hello everyone and welcome to our channel. I'm Dr. Hamza Al-Kinani. Today it is a privilege to host Ambassador Chas Freeman, former Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs and a senior American diplomat with extensive experience in U.S. foreign policy and regional security affairs. Thank you very much for joining me, dear Ambassador Freeman. I'm very pleased to have you with me again.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hamza. I'm pleased to be back.
You are welcome, Ambassador Freeman, always in our show. In this show, we will begin with the U.S. National Defense Strategy 2026 and what it signals about Washington's global posture. We will then turn to U.S.-Iran negotiations and the possibility of a revised agreement similar to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA. We will also examine Iran missiles capabilities, Israel concerns regarding the direction of negotiations, and finally the positioning of Saudi Arabia and Gulf governments aimed at these developments. Ambassador Freeman, given your service as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs and your long experience in U.S. foreign policy, let me begin with the recently announced Pentagon defense strategy. This strategy reflects President Trump's America First approach, emphasizing homeland security and influence in the Western Hemisphere. It builds on the latest national security strategy and makes a shift from post-Cold War policies, singling more limited support for allies and placing less emphasis on threats from China and Russia. From your perspective, what does this shift mean for the future posture of the United States foreign policy in the national system, and what implication does it carry for the Gulf government?
I think the strategy reflects large input from Marco Rubio, the emphasis on the Western Hemisphere as a bastion of American control. I think this is probably going to fail, because I don't believe the states of the Americas, the republics in the Americas, will accept the subjugation to the United States of their sovereignty that this strategy aims to produce. It does emphasize primarily retreat from Europe. And of course, the importance of Europe as a logistical support base for operations in West Asia and in the Mediterranean is hard to overemphasize. So potentially this is a further weakening of the American engagement in West Asia. As a practical matter, whatever the document may say, the United States remains essentially led by the government of Israel in formulating its policies in the region. And we see that most clearly today in the confrontation with Iran. At the very moment when Gulf states on the other side of the Gulf Arabs and Turkey have joined hands to declare that the United States should not use bases on their territory or their airspace to conduct operations against Iran. In effect, this reflects the beginnings of a kind of counter-coalition, including Iran and the Gulf Arabs and Turkey, to balance Israel's efforts to establish hegemony in West Asia. It is not an alliance, it is not even an entente, a limited partnership for limited purposes, but it is a recognition of common interests in preventing the Israeli establishment of supremacy in West Asia. And so we see a distancing from the United States, not in terms of condemning the United States or breaking relations with the United States or even attenuating arms purchases from the United States, but in terms of reaching out to diversify relations to include others, China, Russia, India, other great powers, and thereby, in effect, dilute the overlordship of the United States in the region. Even Israel is trying to do this, but it is most marked in the case of countries like Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates.
Yeah, what about the language in the document? Because normally I would think this is supposed to be a clear-eyed strategy document, not political. And yet, I'm reading it a bit. It's pretty political language, very effusive in its praise of Trump. Like, President Trump has rebuilt American military. President Trump historic and needed to put American interests first. President Trump is leading our nation into a new golden age. Is this sort of language you would expect in a document like this?
No, this is unprecedented, really, in terms of its emulation of the praise singers in Saudi Arabia. I can remember sitting with then Crown Prince Abdullah in his majlis as people recited poems to him that said much the same sort of thing. And so this is actually quite a break with the American tradition. But I have to note that there have always been disconnects between the stated policies and the real ones. And very often the rhetoric out of the White House, which guides the development of these documents, is very difficult to translate into operational policies. So they paper over the difficulty with this kind of political phrasing. I remember particularly in the Clinton administration, there was a statement from then National Security Advisor Anthony Lake, who referred to enlargement and something or other. And I was at the Pentagon, and they said, this is vapidity on stilts. We cannot derive any policy from this. It sounded good. Engagement and enlargement was the phrase. So there's nothing new about rhetoric not being matched with effective strategic formulation.
Ambassador Freeman, before asking you about US and Iran negotiations, I would like to ask you about US policies in Middle East, West Asia. There is a book called Losing the Long Game by Philip Gordon, a former White House coordinator for the Middle East. He served as a special assistant to President Barack Obama and also with Kamala Harris. In chapter 1, he calls it Original Sin, Iran 1953. At the beginning of this chapter, he writes, what they had in mind was nothing less than overthrow of Moscow. He explained more about the US experience in West Asia. Shows the three different approaches. In Iraq, the United States invaded, occupied the country, and spent hundreds of billions of dollars. In Libya, it used military force to remove the regime, but did not stay to stabilize the country, which create a security vacuum. In Syria, it avoided invasion and used a limited intervention, which helped prolong the conflict for more than a decade. In all these cases, the main alliances did not change. Israeli interests were always an important pressure factor in US decision-making, but they were not the only factor. The United States did not fail simply because it supported Israel, but also failed because it tried to use military power for unclear goals, contradictory policies, and unrealistic expectations. So, do you think the same wrong policies, toward Iran will continue today?
Well, the original sin of the overthrow of Mossadegh was indeed a crippling event in U.S. relationships with the Iranian people. That was a democracy. We should have welcomed it, but instead we supported British Petroleum's efforts to reestablish its control over Iranian national resources and put Pahlavi on the throne. Now we confront a different situation. The Islamic Republic, which was formed around 1980, so that is now 45, 46, 47 years ago, really was the first movement in the region to throw off Western tutelage. You may not like Wilayat al-Faqih or the philosophy of rule by religious scholars, but whether you like it or not, it is an indigenous tradition in Iran which replaced a westernizing system with one that was truer to the identity of Iran. And I think in many ways, this produced an overreaction in neighboring countries. I know that King Fahd in Saudi Arabia always regretted having put so much money into the 7 religious universities at the expense of science and technology. And his answer to that, he told me, was, to make sure that al-Qura University in Mecca had a very strong physics and chemistry department, and that less money went in to Quranic studies. There were Iran is a central factor in the history of the region by any standard, whether in ancient times or in modern times. You mentioned the various failures in war, or rather Philip Gordon did in his book. He's absolutely correct. The Gulf War to liberate Kuwait from Iraq, which was a tremendous military victory for the United States and the Islamic coalition that operated alongside it under Khalid bin Sultan, was very successful militarily, but that military success was never translated into a political success. So Saddam Hussein was left like Jamal Abdel Nasser after the Suez Crisis of 1956. He was left in power, and he could say, look, they threw everything they had at me, and I'm still here, and I am strong and powerful. Bow down to me, you fellow Iraqis. It is very important when you want to start a war. The first thing you should do is determine a war termination strategy. What is it that will justify my ending the war? What are the goals? What is the war plan? With whom should I negotiate an end to the war? Why should they accept their defeat? How can I make them accept it? You cannot get onto an aircraft carrier and say, mission accomplished, when the enemy has not accepted his defeat. Wars end when the enemy, the losing side, accepts defeat. And then you have to reconcile that enemy to its defeat. There is no such plan with Iran, nor was there one with Syria. In the case of Syria, we have created a desert and called it peace. That is to say, we have in Damascus in charge somebody who is a very opportunistic person indeed, a famous beheader of people guilty of many sins and crimes, who has now apparently repented, put on a Brooks Brothers suit and tie, and is welcomed in the Oval Office and elsewhere. And of course, Israel has completely disarmed Syria. So Syria has only a vestige of its sovereignty, and nobody has a plan really for putting it back together. So the same is true of Iran. Here we have competing objectives. To the extent that the United States has a clear objective, and the American objectives under the Trump administration typically are not very clear, the objective is the elimination of the alleged nuclear weapons program in Iran. Of course, the intelligence services in Israel and the United States, the CIA, all say Iran has not made a decision to build a bomb. But anyway, the political use of this allegation is enormous. Netanyahu uses it to get the Americans to back his objectives, which have less to do with eliminating the nuclear weapons program in Iran, which may not exist, and more to do with removing Iran as a strategic competitor in West Asia, and it's eliminating it as a possible enemy of consequence for Israel. Since Israel cannot do this on its own, it has tried to get the United States to do it for it. I think in the last meeting between Netanyahu and Trump in Washington, not at Mar-a-Lago, a month ago or so, they agreed there would be an attack on Iran. I think they both then sobered up because Iran has progressed quite a bit in both its strategic thinking and its weaponry. And Iran reportedly plans to respond to any sort of attack on it, not with the limited response that it has conducted in the past, It has never targeted anything but intelligence and military facilities. In Israel, it has not targeted civilian facilities, and it has been restrained. When it attacked Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, it did so purely symbolically after making sure nobody would be killed on the American side. It has made it clear that if there is an attack, it will go all out. It will not be limited in its response. And it has stated that it is prepared to fire 2,000 missiles at once in a single barrage at Israel. Let me add something else. There has been a huge buildup of F-35s, F-16s, presumably F-15s as well, in Azerbaijan and in Armenia. So when Iran says that an attack on it would result in a regional war, it is not just talking about attacking the Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier or mobilizing forces in Iraq to attack American forces there, or possibly to attack those bases in the Gulf that are in countries that are in the Abraham Accords and colluding with Israel. It's talking about Azerbaijan and Armenia, as well as Israel itself. So there would be a regional war. And it is for that reason that the Gulf Arabs, even those who are in the Abraham Accords, like the UAE, have said that they do not want to be part of any war on Iran. And they urged the United States not to attack Iran. I started with that. But I would say Bahrain, which is the headquarters of the Fifth Fleet, is in a different category. And I think in the case of Saudi Arabia, the Saudis have been very careful to differentiate themselves from the American plans. And of course, they have achieved a measure of rapprochement with Iran. As I said, I think there is an informal coalition against this war, which unites the Gulf Arabs, most of them, with the Iranians and with the Turks, in trying to stay out of the war, trying to prevent a war, and trying to ensure that Iran remains a balancer of Israel. There is now, in other words, an unacknowledged stake by the Gulf Arabs in the continued existence of the Islamic Republic. Kind of hard to believe, but there we are.
Ambassador Freeman, you mentioned the meeting between President Trump and Netanyahu. Many analysts say President Trump faces a serious challenge in reaching a negotiated settlement with Iran. Some in Israel, especially Prime Minister of Israel Netanyahu, argue that any agreement with Iran is a waste of time because Iran cannot be trusted. If you agree with me, Ambassador Freeman, that Israel wants three main things to be included in any deal with Iran. Number one, uranium enrichment. Number two, Iran ballistic missile program. Number three, Iran support for Hezbollah and Hamas. But it seems that the Trump administration may focus mainly on uranium enrichment and may even accept limited enrichment. Israel, however, wants all the enrichment facilities removed. This, if you agree with me, this creates tension between United States and Israel. Do you agree that this is the main challenge facing President Trump in trying to reach a deal with Iran?
I think you're correct, and you can see that before the meeting that is scheduled for Muscat in Oman, the United States insisted the meeting be in Istanbul and planned to have the GCC members, the Gulf Cooperation Council, Arab members present, in effect, adding to the pressure on Iran. The GCC did not agree, nor did the Iranians. Marco Rubio said that of the Istanbul meeting, that it had to have three items on its agenda. One was the nuclear program, the other was Iran disarming its missile force, and third, the severance of relationships with Iran's various client movements, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen. And he said, without these three items being on the agenda, there would be no meeting. So the Iranians said, okay, no meeting. And then we moved the meeting to Muscat. And it's very clear from the last discussion in Washington between Netanyahu and Trump that Trump wants a deal. That's what he likes. He had a deal, of course, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal. He tore it up. He said he would get a better deal. I think that's what he's trying for. I think that scares Netanyahu, because Netanyahu has an ambition to go down in history as the establisher of greater Israel, meaning a much larger Israel than just Palestine. This is why the Israelis are taking land in Syria, why they're taking land in Lebanon. You see the maps that they wear, which include all of Jordan, part of Iraq, and part of northern Saudi Arabia, as well as part of Egypt, east of the Nile. Netanyahu wants to be the Moses of modern Israel. Trump's eagerness for an agreement on a limited agenda threatens that. So there's no agreement between them. But on the other hand, Trump has basically painted himself into a corner. He's moved a huge military force, not the naval force, which is not so formidable, but the Air Force into the region. He has threatened Iran with annihilation. He has embraced the objective of regime change and poses an existential threat to Iran. And there is no way on God's earth that Iran is going to disarm itself or give up its relations with the various elements of resistance to Israeli hegemony in West Asia. Whether they're very useful or not anymore is an open question, given the extent to which Israel has succeeded in weakening them. But still, these are assets for Iran, and it's not going to give them up. And I just sort of finish by saying, in the early days of the Islamic Republic, and even a decade ago, the contest between the Sunni Arabs led by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, maybe perhaps Qatar on occasion, in opposing Iranian-backed movements, especially Hezbollah in Lebanon, or the Assad government in Syria. This is, it's very strong. That's not the case anymore. The government of Saudi Arabia no longer has a foreign policy based on religious schism. It's not aimed at eliminating Shia power, and it is aimed at geopolitical objectives, which include expanding the influence of Saudi Arabia politically in the region, achieving a balance with other powers that protects it against attack. This is why you have a pact between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, in which implicitly Pakistan has offered an extended deterrence of nuclear weapons to Saudi Arabia. Against who? The only nuclear power in the region is Israel. So you said at the outset you wanted to talk about the difference between public policy and private action on the part of the Gulf Arabs. I mean, obviously, for many years, the Istihbarat in Saudi Arabia and the Mossad have had a relationship. And I think, I can't prove this, that the atrocity in the Consulate General in Istanbul that was conducted against my friend Jamal Khashoggi was in fact conducted by people who had been trained by Israelis. All of the earmarks of an Israeli presence or technique was there. And here we have an Israeli journalist very closely connected to the Mossad and to the Anan, the Israeli military intelligence, Ronan Bergman, who wrote a book called Rise and Strike First, which documents over 3,000 assassinations of people in the region and working in it, and Germans working for Nasser's Egypt, for example, by the Mossad. And we see assassination as a regular part of Israeli policy, not just toward Hamas. I mean, Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated in Tehran during the presidential inauguration of Pezeshkian, but and not just toward Hamas, but toward Iranian nuclear scientists and engineers, toward any European who hires out to work for a government developing weapons of mass destruction, and for politicians in Lebanon who are opposed to Israel, Nasrallah, for example. So here we have a government in Israel that is very pragmatic, and which has extended its techniques, its knowledge, its capabilities to other intelligence services in the region. And finally, I would note that Israel has used its oppression of the Palestinians as a laboratory to develop weapons and systems of surveillance that are its principal export to the UAE, for example, and I think in Saudi Arabia also. That is to say, Israel has perfected a police state, and we have in the region countries that depend on police power to maintain stability. Whether they are police states or not is a terminological question, but clearly they rely on the mukhabarat, or the equivalent, to maintain their authority. So Israel is very useful in that regard. So we have a public policy which reflects popular opinion. Polling data shows that Israel is utterly despised by populations in the Gulf for the things that it does in places like Gaza or the West Bank. And the nightly television, as you know, in the region is quite graphic, has been quite graphic, with channels like Al Jazeera showing very brutal actions by the Israeli Defense Forces against the Palestinians. So you have 95, 97% of the population opposed to any normalization with Israel. That didn't stop the normalization between UAE and Israel, but it is something that King Salman in Saudi Arabia is aware of, and Mohammed bin Salman has been forced to respect that sentiment. So whatever normalization might have been possible between Saudi Arabia and Israel is off the table. That doesn't mean that the clandestine, covert connections between the Istihbarat and Mossad are not continuing. I mean, they are, of course, because Saudi Arabia is also pragmatic, and it respects power more than anything else. So Israel has power. Israel has knowledge. If we had peace in West Asia, Israeli technology would be a wonderful partner for all of the countries in the region. I'm not talking about surveillance technology. I'm talking about technology in general. But there is no peace, and the Abraham Accords proceeded on a wrong assumption, which was that you could buy off the Palestinian issue by economic relationships without addressing the political problems. And now we have the ugly spectacle of the Trump family and its associates, Witkoff, Kushner, and so on, trying to cash in on genocide in Gaza, which is exactly what it is. Genocide has cleared the land of buildings and people, potentially, and it's like an urban renewal project. Now you can go in there and build a magnificent resort, they claim. Well, this is absolutely appalling. It's not going to happen. And You cannot have a government of Palestinians which has no Palestinian member, which is what they're proposing. So essentially, they are going to reduce, their model is to reduce Gaza to the moral equivalent of, let us say, Qatar or the UAE, where you have a ruling native elite, in this case Israeli, and they are served by expat labor force, which has no rights. They are the bidun, as the Kuwaitis call them. So this is all what is happening. And phase two of the so-called ceasefire peace agreement in Gaza is never going to be implemented. And while it isn't, Israel's reputation internationally and in the region will continue to deteriorate. So I think this is very bad for Israel, but most Israelis disagree with me.
If you're seeking a space where intellect is valued, where deep, rational analysis meets global perspectives, you have found it. Explore the world's most important issues. Follow Dr. Hamza Al-Kinani to enrich the mind, not arouse emotions. Find him at Dr. HK88 on X, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram.
Ambassador Freeman, last year during the 12-day war, Israel acted while diplomacy was still ongoing. Also, Iran's ballistic missile attacks surprised Israel and exposed weaknesses in its defenses. I have two questions for you here. First, do you think Israel demands have increased over time, especially after the missile experience last year? Second, do you think Israel will attack Iran again while the negotiations still ongoing?
I think you're quite right to raise that question because, of course, the last time there was a meeting in Muscat, it was used as a deception for a surprise attack by both Israel and the United States. It was very clear that that was planned. It was not something that happened on the spur of the moment. There are people in Israel who hope the same thing will happen now, but I don't think so. The second point, however, is after Mr. Netanyahu returned to Israel from Washington, having tried to get an American commitment to start a war with Iran, I think his own military told him this would be possibly devastating for Israel because they do not have the ability to intercept and destroy more than a fraction of the rockets that Iran can fire at them. And in fact, in the previous three rounds, the one that followed the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, beginning, and the most recent June so-called 12-day war, Israel ran out of the ability to defend itself. And it wasn't able to defend itself without very significant American and British support. So Israel has learned the hard way that in Iran, it is up against an enemy that can strike back effectively. Israel has been accustomed to running over its enemies, either with clever battle plans, as they did with the murder of Nasrallah in Lebanon, or on the battlefield itself. I mean, here is Israel, which is armed with the most modern weaponry available, and after 2.5 years, it has not been able to subdue Hamas. Hamas has rifles and grenades and maybe an rocket-propelled grenade or two, light weaponry. Israel has everything. It has not succeeded in defeating Hamas. The whole ceasefire, so-called, because there is no ceasefire. Israel continues to attack Palestinians daily. The so-called ceasefire in Gaza is an effort by Israel to get the United States to disarm Hamas because it wasn't able to do that through the use of force. So I think Netanyahu went home and he was told, hey, wait a minute, the Americans don't have enough forces in the region to really defend us. And Iran is far more formidable than you believe. And Donald Trump may, after Venezuela, believe that there's nothing his military can't do, but we know better. And if there is a war with Iran, Israel is going to pay a really heavy price, especially if the Americans don't increase their support of us. So that resulted in the Abraham Lincoln being called from the South China Sea. That resulted in the deployment of Gerald R. Ford from the Caribbean to the Eastern Mediterranean. That resulted in the deployment of even more forces into Armenia and Azerbaijan. That resulted in the deployment of THAAD, Theater High Altitude Air Defense systems to Israel, along with more Patriot missiles. But I'm sorry to say that THAAD cannot intercept hypersonic missiles of the sort that the Iranians have developed. So Israel is not naked, but it is not going to be able to mount a credible defense if this war happens. In the 12-day war, every rich Israeli who had a connection was hiring boats and planes to fly to Cyprus. There was a huge surge of people leaving Israel anywhere. They wanted to go anywhere but be in. And many of them have not come back. So, if your only approach to coexistence with your neighbors and the inhabitants of the land you have taken is military, then you have to sleep with your eye open and the gun at your side. And this is not a comfortable position for anybody to be in, even if you don't consider the economic damage that the constant deployment of the reserve force by the Israelis has entailed. Something like 80,000 small business bankruptcies, the relocation of startup businesses, technology businesses, away from Israel for to be conducted in other places, the emigration of people, a very bad mood, a great division among Israelis of all kinds. The ultra-Orthodox Israelis objecting to the possibility that they will be forced to join the army rather than study the Torah, and liberal democratic Israelis turned off by the attacks on the judiciary and its independence, and Netanyahu staying in office mainly by starting wars, so he can claim that he's a wartime leader and can't be displaced. That is not a happy country now, and it will be much unhappier if there is a war with Iran. How widespread that war would be at this point is an open question. Is the fact that the United Arab Emirates are members of the so-called Abraham Accords enough to make them a target for Iran? Maybe. They have said they don't want to be part of this war if it happens. Can they avoid it? I don't know.
Ambassador Freeman, let's talk about the midterm election. Would a deal with Iran help Trump win the midterm elections?
I think he's going to lose the midterm elections anyway, not for reasons connected to the Middle East particularly. But the people of Minnesota have demonstrated a level of resolve and discipline which is quite striking. And they're being nominated now for a Nobel Peace Prize for that, which I think they should get. So we have the domestic breakdown of law and order, lawlessness at home, which is matched with lawlessness abroad. And the two are connected, and many people in the United States are opposed to both. So quite aside from what happens in West Asia, I think Mr. Trump is politically in difficulty. And when you look at the midterms, assuming he's unable to stop them, which he started talking about because he realizes he will lose, assuming they go forward constitutionally under the control of the states rather than the federal government, as he proposes to nationalize the election somehow, then I don't think the events in West Asia will count for much except in one area, and that is the level of donations from Zionist plutocrats, which he depends on. Miriam Adelson is, of course, the most prominent such person, but there are others, and they may very well withhold funds if they don't regard him as having been sufficiently supportive of Israel. But there was recently a by-election in the United States, and I think in the state of Wisconsin, and the AIPAC-backed candidate lost big. Why? Because he was backed by AIPAC. Because nobody likes AIPAC anymore. Well, of course, some people do, but most people don't, and don't like the idea that a foreign government can, through an American cutout, control American politics. So, yes, I think these issues are all changing. The younger generation of American Jews do not want to be associated with the Zionist state. And you can see this in the polling data. So the older Jewish community members, of course, there are many Jewish communities. I'm not Jewish, but I have some of my children have married Jews, one of them at least, and so I'm very aware of what is going on in the various American communities of Jews, which are, there's no unity in them. They all disagree about everything, and they now more and more disagree about Israel. So this is a big change, and it is, I think, very significant. So this will weigh on Mr. Trump. He is in the pocket of these plutocratic donors, and many of whom are Jewish, and strong supporters of Israel. His son-in-law and his cronies, Witkoff, Kushner, are Jewish, not just Jewish, but Zionist. So this has a bearing. You can be Jewish and be anti-Zionist, and indeed, many of the most outspoken and, in my view, courageous opponents of Zionism are Jewish. And if I had a hat on, I would talk to them.
Ambassador Freeman, we have seen Saudi Arabia government publicly support Iran's sovereignty and call for dialogue to avoid war. At the same time, reports say the Saudi Defense Minister Prince Khalid bin Salman visited Washington and met U.S. and Israeli officials to discuss Iran and possible military options. Some critics call this as a dual-track diplomacy, saying one thing in public and doing something different in private. British sociologist David Miller described it as a four-dimensional chess. So the question is, Ambassador Freeman, do you see this as a contradictory diplomacy or as a normal strategy in a tense regional environment?
Well, there's a history here that bears on this, and that goes back to what I mentioned earlier about external support for minority ethnic groups' desire for independence and the breakup of Iran, the Baluch, for example, in particular. There is a region of Iran called Arabistan, which is mainly Arab in population. There are the Kurds. The Israelis have been in bed with the Kurds and the Baluch. And the Indians have been involved in Pakistani Baluchistan, agitating things. So there's a lot of undercover, covert action history here, and some of it is cooperative between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which have shared a desire to see regime change in Iran. But I think, we've come now to a different moment in which it is the Iranian state that is important to Saudi Arabia. That doesn't mean that Saudis wouldn't like to see a change of government in Iran, a government that was more open to cooperation than the current government. Maybe a replacement for the Islamic Republic, which I don't think is likely, by the way. I think, especially if you put a lot of pressure on Iranians, they do what all people do when you put pressure on them. They get their backs up. They stand firm. They rally behind the flag. They don't, if you bomb somebody, they don't say, "Oh, this is the fault of my government." They say it's the fault of the foreigners who are bombing me. So there's a contradiction here. On the one hand, I think Gulf Arabs would be delighted to see a change of government in Iran. On the other hand, they need Iran now as a balancer to Israel. And they certainly need Iran to continue to take account of their interests as it conducts its policy, which Iran does, by the way. I mean, there are disputes, the Lesser Tums Islands in the Strait of Hormuz between Iran and the UAE. There are, of course, ideological differences, theological differences that are quite considerable. And I know when I was in the region, which I was only fairly briefly, because the bulk of my career was spent elsewhere, I know that most Saudis seem to have a firm belief that people in Iran had a genetic defect, namely they were Persian. And this was incorrigible. And there was a phrase cited to me: if you see a Persian and a snake, kill the Persian first. So there's that feeling. And then in Iran, they look down on Arabs. They don't have a high opinion of Arabs. So there are emotional, ethnic, religious differences which are very firmly rooted in history and in popular opinion on both sides. That limits the extent to which relations can easily be established. But you mentioned offensive realism. Offensive or not, realism is now in power in both Riyadh and Tehran. And it has been for some time. I remember my friend King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, when he became the de facto ruler. Before he was king, he was this because of Fahed's incapacitation. He was in effect running things, and I remember him when I was ambassador, and he was crown prince, and I used to go see him sometimes on instructions, and he was the most anti-Iranian member of the royal family. Absolutely foamed at the mouth when he talked about Iran. He was very interested in putting the baby Shah on the throne or doing some kind of regime change operation. I did not encourage that. But anyway, when he actually took power, the first thing he did was make peace with Raisi. He went to a meeting in Dakar in Senegal, an Islamic conference meeting, and he patched it up with Raisi. So I was no longer ambassador, I was just a private citizen. But when I saw him, I said to him, I was very impressed by this. And he said, when you have power, you have to be realistic. When you don't have power, he said, when I was crown prince, I had no power. Fahed, Sultan, Naif, they all made the decisions. And sometimes they would include Prince Salman, but they never included me. So he said, you used to come see me and take me seriously. I appreciate that. I had a lot of time to think. But anyway, now I have power. I have to exercise it for the nation. There's a word for this in Western diplomatic parlance, which is French, of course, raison d'etat. reason of state. I do not have the ability, I do not have the freedom when I occupy a position in the defense of the state to impose my own personal preferences on decisions. I must make the decisions with reference to my country, not my own ideas. But that was his view. That is very much the view in Tehran and in Riyadh these days. You mentioned Khalid bin Salman going to Washington. Of course, he also went to Tehran. Saudi Arabia is playing all sides against each other. I guess that is offensive realism.
Ambassador Freeman, last word for today, if you'd like to add anything, especially if you'd like to say something about Epstein files.
Epstein plays in the region mainly because that's another reason for Donald J. Trump to have tried to distract everybody by starting a war, which is what Netanyahu does. When he gets in political trouble, he tries to start a war to distract everybody's attention from whatever it was that he got him into trouble. And Trump is motivated largely by political concerns at home. So he wants to do something with Iran. I think he wants a deal. I think he's put himself in a position where he's going to have to go to war. I hope not, but I think that is the position. Anyway, all of this attracts attention away from the kind of thing that happened the other day between Attorney General Pam Bondi and members of Congress. The Epstein thing is not going away, but it is an endless incentive to try to turn attention elsewhere. And that's what we're seeing. I think there were elements of that in the Venezuelan issue, but of course the reason for Venezuela is the ability, having control of Venezuela, to cut off oil to Cuba and thereby immiserate Cubans on the theory that if you make people miserable enough, they will somehow blame their own government rather than you, which remains to be proven. But certainly there is a hard line now directed at Cuba, and I think Marco Rubio, who is of Cuban descent, is the architect of this policy. As for the UAE and Saudi Arabia, this started off with a mutual admiration society between Mohammed bin Zayed and Mohammed bin Salman. That mutual admiration has apparently evaporated for the reasons I mentioned. UAE is trying to ensure that its influence is entrenched throughout the region. Libya is part of that. I gather that Saudi Arabia is now reestablishing its embassy in Tripoli, Tarablos, and that is an indication again of a difference. So Somalia, Sudan, Libya, Syria in the past, this is a rivalry that that it was really quite unexpected, but it reflects the activism of the UAE and the relatively conservative status quo interests of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has enough issues. It is trying to transform itself and having some difficulty because it is doing so while oil prices are low and therefore money is limited. And the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, derives a lot of his ideas from video games, which he plays a lot of. And it turns out that's not easy to translate into reality. So we see some curtailment of NEOM, and I guess the Winter Olympics won't take place in Saudi Arabia after all. And but it's an intelligent policy to transform Saudi Arabia. You cannot remain dependent forever on oil as a source of wealth. And this was very apparent. When I was ambassador, the Minister of Petroleum was also the Minister of Planning. And Saudi Arabia had plans very similar to those of Vision 2030. That was 30-some years ago. Saudi Arabia did not make decisions easily back then. You had to consult with multiple branches of the royal family and with the real wealthy merchants in the Hijaz and less so in the Eastern Province. And Mohammed bin Salman has made decisions, not all of them correct, some of them terrible, some of them a mistake. The war in Yemen was not a good idea, but he makes decisions. And unfortunately for him, he doesn't have the money at the moment to make all the decisions he would like. So this is a difficult moment for the kingdom. It does not want trouble in its region, and that is understandable. UAE doesn't care.
Thank you, Ambassador Freeman. At the end of our meeting with you, I would like to thank you, Ambassador. It was my great honor to have you again on my show. Thank you for your time and thank you for your generosity. Thanks to you also, dear followers. Until we meet again, here is Hamza Al-Kinani to enrich the mind, not to arouse emotions.